And this time we'll be exploring the state of open banking and the emerging financial grade API standards that are happening across the globe. So first off, what is open banking? Well, for those of you unfamiliar, open banking is a global phenomenon in which banking data is becoming more and more accessible for third-party developers and end users. This is allowing users to have better ownership and control over their financial data. And through standardized APIs, open banking can more seamlessly integrate with fintech companies that are building new tools and visualizations of this data. Open banking is undoubtedly unlocking new business models and innovations for the financial sector. But not every country is in 100% agreement on how exactly banking data should be exposed. Different regions have varying open banking implementation standards, as well as different developer experiences, which we'll see more of today. For example, the European Union was the first major body to regulate open banking with PSD2. The United States, though, has yet to issue a sweeping regulation, instead allowing more of the market to encourage adoption. There's also the fintech law in Mexico, the consumer data right in Australia, open banking in Brazil, and others. And all of these will require a standardized format for sharing financial data access. And it's typically done through APIs. In addition to the data exchange method adopted, the industry will definitely require financial grade API security to protect data in transit. And this has birthed an entire new class of different security standards, some of which we'll review today. So without ado, I'd like to hand the reins over to today's speakers. We've brought in two great experts to talk about the state of open banking standards, both of which have a lot of experience specifically in this field. And first up, we'll be featuring Chris Wood, Freelance API Architect, and he'll be delivering a brief presentation on developer experiences across different open banking landscapes. And then we'll hand things over to Daniel from Curity, who will explore financial grade security for APIs and some of the different standards around that. So I'll end my share here and then hand things over to Chris to get us started.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us on this live cast. As Bill's already pointed out, my name's Chris Wood. My background with open banking comes from the UK. I was an architect working for the OBIE, the Open Banking Implementation Entity, which is the body that looked after the development of standards in the UK. So I co-wrote parts of the standards over 2 periods of time. So that's where my background comes. I've got a keen interest still in open banking, having moved on from Open Banking Implementation Entity. I'll now call it OBIE for short. What I'm going to talk about today is how the standards bodies that exist across the world have an important role to play in developer experience. Your initial thoughts on this might be, you're nuts, but why does a standards body affect developer experience? But as you will hopefully see in the next 20 minutes, there is a critical role for standards bodies to play. So just by way of an agenda, we're going to just look at why standards are important, but also then how the standards bodies can then play a role in developer experience. What's the role they should actually be playing, and then do a little bit of show and tell, compare and contrast examples from different markets, to show how the developer experience for a given standards body can benefit developers and help them do what they need to do in order to develop their applications that integrate with open banking APIs. So why are standards important? I mean, that's our starting point, right? If we need to just give ourselves some context, what do standards actually do for open banking? Well, as has been seen in almost every market, standards provide the opportunity to level the playing field for the industry. I mean, the concept of open banking has been around for many, many years. The Open Bank project came about in the early last decade, and many banks got interested in that project, but there was never really enough traction to generate an ecosystem or a market. So along comes regulation. In the EU, we have PSD2. In the UK, we have the CMA order. So governments actually specifying regulations that therefore force the market open, force the open banking ecosystem into being. So we have two ways of going. One way is all banks can publish their own APIs. None of them are standardized. Every single consumer of those APIs needs to do something different with each bank, or we apply standards to get a level playing field. And this is where standards have been important in fostering the ecosystem, is banks that come under the regulations of PSD2 or the equivalent in their territory, they need to adopt a standard in order to provide APIs to the market that give all participants a fighting chance of actually competing in this market. So number one, standards are important because they create this level playing field for all participants. They also help to then set expectations. What kind of APIs are in the market? What data or services can I get from those APIs that the banks are hosting? So very much that starts to foster the ecosystem. People understand what they're getting into when they're in this market. So that has an effect of getting more and more players into the ecosystem. But at a technical level, the standards themselves and the standards bodies that foster them, they have to provide baseline technical standards. An API design of what the APIs they're exposing the banks are exposing should look like. For example, what should the customer experience look like where customers are using open banking standards? So very important for again, setting that level playing field, setting expectations, making sure that there's a solid basis for the market to grow. Open banking isn't just about standards, it's about commercial opportunities as well, both on the third party side and the bank side. But in order to have that, standards have been really, really important. And lastly, the standards bodies also provide the technical operating model. How do third parties and the banks interact with each other? Who governs things like security? Who governs things like SLAs? The actual business, if you like, operating model is typically done in regulation. But on the technical side, the standards bodies definitely have a role to play here in establishing an operating model. So that's the importance of standards. But why do I think that the developer experience also sits within the remit of the standards bodies, the people that are actually crafting and publishing these standards? Well, in my opinion, one of the things that standards bodies should also do is provide a backstop for developers looking for answers. The standards bodies have a wealth of information. They're in charge of or orchestrating the development of the standards themselves. They know the process. They're working with lots and lots of participants. Therefore, there's a wealth of knowledge, both in terms of the standards they're actually publishing and also the kind of the collateral that they're collecting in the process of doing this, where they can help the developer community. Actually, if a developer's gone to a given bank and the bank, in what they've published inside their portal or whatever, they can't actually get the information they need. If that's a standards-based API, they should be able to come back to the standards body and access information that's critical to understanding how the APIs operate. So actually, there is this kind of role for the standards bodies in providing a developer experience that actually gives them that wealth of information in the kind of the market overview of the standards themselves. Yeah, sure, developers, when they integrate with a given bank, they need to talk to that bank in order to register their client, be able to integrate with those APIs specifically, get their well-known information so that they've got their their token endpoint and all that kind of stuff, the actual implementation. But this kind of design side where there's this wealth of information that the standards bodies hold, it's really important that that actually supports the market in their endeavors. So this is what I mean by developer experience for standards bodies, is actually taking the information they have and promoting that and providing it to the developer community, in order to support the experience, the development of the ecosystem. So, as I said, this is subjective, but from my view, there's some of these things that the standards bodies should do. One, define the approach for standards development. That means working within the ecosystem to get all participants involved and publishing a well-known mechanism for the publication of standards, so that every participant knows what's in the roadmap, when a new release comes along, what's actually included in that release. So they provide a really useful reference point for the ecosystem. The second thing is to publish and promote the standards to the community. When a standards body creates a new version of standards, obviously it's in their gift to make sure that information is well published, that all participants are able to access that information, and they should also promote it. The fact of the matter is, it's in their ability to actually go to the market and say, there's this new version of the standards, it has these features available, therefore when banks adopt these APIs or features or whatever, you really should take advantage of them. In all of this, the standards body should really then be championing the needs of developers. It's not just about creating a specification that just gets implemented by the banks and that's the end of the job. It's actually, how can we make these APIs the best they can be? What API styles best suits the market needs, for example. So really being on side of the development community and helping make decisions that are in the best interests of everybody concerned. And then lastly, the standards bodies should be driving the development of future standards. And in doing so, collating information from the community, making sure that they take into account the needs of third-party providers, the needs of the banks, any protagonist who's actually got an interest in the market, making sure they're accounting for what actually gives the best chance of success for the open banking ecosystem. So I say these are my views, but I also believe that some of this is already reflected in how the standards bodies present themselves. So for those kind of define, publish, and champion aspects that I just went through, we're going to have a look at a few different examples. So just close the slides for a moment and just for the next 7 or 8 minutes, just look at a few examples of what different standards bodies do out there in the market at the moment. So first one, and as I said, I worked here, obviously close to my heart, but this is the portal for the OBIE, the UK standards body. As you can see, that I have to confess, this work post-dated my time there, so I can't take any credit for it. But this is essentially their portal where it's easily found through Google. If you go into it, obviously there's different sections that suit different audiences. So the API specifications themselves, a security profile, because the UK inherits part of API, customer experience guidelines, operational guidelines, and reference information. So if I just go into the API specifications, this is all then chopped up into different types. The most important from the sense of the market, are the read-write API specifications. So that's access to account information and the ability to make a payment. If I go into this, you'll see that this portal has been structured so that there is a fresh version of the documentation, and I'm not going to show it now, and somewhere else there's a change log that shows different versions of the API specification over time. So at the moment, published on this portal is version 3.1.2 upwards. Nicely laid out, it's easy to navigate. On the left-hand side, different APIs are shown. As I said, account information and payment initiation are probably the main two, confirmation of funds and others, most recently variable recurring payments, is all in here. So easy to navigate, and then it's got a companion of a GitHub repository with all the open API documents that are used to create the APIs and consume the APIs, available as well. So the point here is open banking very keen to promote the needs of developers. UK Open Banking very keen to promote the needs of developers. They went all out to create something that really reflected that viewpoint. And the portal was easy to navigate. It's HTML based, relatively easy to search. The API specifications are published to a well-known location. So in terms of a developer experience, pretty easy to find any information you might need at a standards level here. So moving on to the Berlin Group. Berlin Group is obviously another standards body in Europe. It's very, very popular, not just in Germany, but across other markets as well. Many Swedish banks, for example, implement this. So I'm on their site at the moment. So everything's here, everything you could ever need in terms of integrating with everything you could ever need to understand the Berlin Group standard. The only quid pro quo here is everything's in PDFs, so it just makes it that little bit more difficult to navigate. So the information's here, it's been published, but PDF information is relatively hard to mine and understand. So everything's available, but there's just this drawback of PDF based information that just makes it a little bit more difficult. Then moving on to FDX. FDX is obviously the salient standard in North America. I would love to show you the developer experience, but unfortunately I don't have access. So FDX paywalls their standards, and you can become an FDX observer, so that you can see the standards, but you can't take part in their development. I would love to show you them, but unfortunately my access request was denied the last time I tried. So unfortunate that this is hidden away behind closed doors. In terms of fostering an open ecosystem and giving developers what they need, that becomes quite tricky. But obviously FDX has their reasons for doing this. So last one second to last one, sorry, I'm just going to flip through is Brazil Open Banking. Brazil Open Banking is probably the most aggressively growing open banking market. They've got very aggressive timescales. They're moving on very quickly from open banking to open issuance. So it's largely run by the central bank. This is their main page with lots and lots of information. This is their developer portal. Now, I won't refresh the page, but this developer portal has a myriad of different information, but it's absolutely huge and somewhat difficult to navigate. Everything's bundled into the one place. It's a slightly haphazard in terms of how it changes. I worked for about 4 months last year doing a project against these standards, and it was difficult to understand when they were changing, why, and how. So in terms of the experience for developers, that can be a bit confusing. I would imagine, I haven't gone back and checked this, that times have changed. We've moved on a year. It's a bit a bit better orchestrated in terms of changes actually being made to the standards. So again, another example. Interesting thing about, just as a last point, it's not just about standards bodies that are creating the API specifications. It's about standards bodies that we're going to have a look at in a moment, which is the financial grade API standards, FAPI, which is part of OpenID Foundation. Obviously, I've just picked up the Brazil certification framework. Here, there's a security profile for Brazil for FAPI. So in terms of the OpenID Foundation's role, they're very active in Brazil. They run workshops. They ensure that they publish a lot of information elsewhere. I haven't got it on the screen. There's significant coverage of the security profile, including guidelines for what TPPs should do at an industry level. So lots and lots of useful information that serve the community in a very wide way. So just bringing that to a close, I just wanted to sort of give some examples of why that kind of style of developer experience from standards bodies is important. I just go back to my slideshow. So I'll sort of bring it together like this. I haven't included the FAPI group on this, but in terms of this define, publish, and champion, the UK open banking, obviously, for me, does this really well, and so does Brazil. FDX, I can't really tell because I can't really have a look, but I know that FDX champions their standards in different ways. They recruit people from the OpenID Foundation to lead some of their initiatives in terms of how they promote themselves, as an example. So it's not just about the developer portal and all the rest of it. It's having the right spokespeople in the right places in order to champion what's going on. The Berlin group, they're very good at definition. The publication, obviously, from my perspective, I feel that way of publishing standards is less intuitive and less easy to use, and it makes it difficult to then actually take that information and use it elsewhere. This last one, driving the development of future standards, obviously, the Berlin Group is turning out specifications for open finance. FDX is on version 5, and that's being well marketed. Brazil open banking, we're into open insurance, as I said. The UK has actually had the opposite experience, let's say, because there's been bad press about the OBIE and certain, for want of a better word, scandals about how various members of staff conducted themselves. That's kind of driven the OBIE into a bit of stasis. The UK market's kind of picking itself up again very slowly, but the impetus has gone away from what the OBIE was doing to a wider industry consensus. So in terms of driving development, it's kind of slow to a halt at the moment. We're hoping that's going to pick up very soon. So just in conclusion, my opinion is that developers need the standards bodies to work for them, to set the means for delivering the standards, publish those standards, promote them, champion their needs. And only by doing that can those standards bodies drive the success of the developer community, which actually drives the success of open banking and open finance and open energy and everything else that's coming in terms of open ecosystems based on APIs. Okay, that's the end of my presentation. Thanks for listening.
Fantastic. Thanks, Chris. And listeners can also check out the Nordic API's blog for some of Chris's musings on the whole open everything concept. I know he's written about that before. A lot of great material there. I have a lot of questions, but we're going to save that for the end of Daniel's presentation. So now we're just going to dive straight into these financial grade API security profiles. and then kind of regroup later on. So take it away, Daniel.
There, without the mute, works better. Hey, I'm Daniel. I am working as a solution architect and identity specialist with Curity. I've been part of a lot of different open banking projects over the years, mostly around Europe, but also in later projects in Brazil and things like that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my experience around that and how to use the OpenID standards around that and how those have evolved. So in those early projects where around the UK Open Bank and the PSD2 projects, a lot of different things just evolve around strong customer authentication and how do we onboard new TPPs and how do we do payment transactions where users actually get to consent to what is happening right now and just not just authenticating. So there was a lot of work there being done, and a lot of it cooked down to these three things that I'm going to talk about the most today. Of course, it's not the full picture, but at least it's some of it. And a big part of it is, of course, the OpenID code flow that mandates a standards-based protocol for obtaining tokens to be able to access these APIs that the PSD2 banks are publishing. And also the use of mutual TLS to be able to authenticate TPPs and clients in a secure way, in a trustworthy way, but also a pattern that came out of, not sure which group it is, but the logic intent pattern was used heavily, or is used still, for the payment transaction use case. So I'm going to look into these a little bit and see how we can improve them with the standards that came after that. But first, just walk through these use cases just to have them fresh in mind. So the OAuth or OpenID Connect code flow it was used because it's well known, it's widely deployed. It's of course standards based, but it's already kind of a de facto standard for these types of clients to be used. So it's not something that we had to invent to start using in open banking. But one strong part of it is that it enables the token-based architecture, but also allows you to have a centralized authentication of your users. So it's natural to start using this in an open banking flow. Just a quick recap. The code flow consists of two different channels. We have a front channel, which is probably a browser, and we have a back channel that's happening outside of the browser where a third party can contact the authorization server out of band, so to say. But the code flow starts like this. It starts in a browser where the client directs the user over to the AS with some parameters asking for access. So in this case, we have a client called third that is asking for access to the scope read on behalf of my current user. So right now, there's no authentication going on, I'm just identifying myself as client ID. So the bank can accept that request and say, well, this might be client third. I don't know yet, but at least I will authenticate the user with some means I have available, preferably a strong method like this, using a FIDO key or something like that. But I authenticate the user and give back a code to the TPP or to the client. This code represents somehow that the user authenticated and give away some access. The client doesn't know what yet, but the code itself doesn't bear any proof. We need to authenticate the client to be able to switch this to actual tokens. So the client, the third-party client, switches channels over to the back channel now. So the green channels is in the back channel, happens outside of the browser. And here, the client sends in the code it received in the previous step, but also its credentials, authenticating that it actually is the trusted client that is now calling the authorization server. if those credentials pan out, we will get a bunch of tokens that we can use in different ways. But most importantly, the access token that represents that the user delegated its access to a specific scope to my client, which can then be used towards the APIs. So this token is then used in these APIs to authorize the request, and can see that, well, it was user Daniel using the client third. Am I allowed to give away the data it's actually requesting right now? So this is standard OAuth code flow, nothing fancy at all. Of course, a great one, but it has some limitations that an open banking flow can run into. First of all, the client authentication is typically a secret. Even if it's in the back channel, it's only relying on that fact that it's a secret. There's no client authentication in the front channel. We're only saying I am client third. We have no way of authenticating that. And also clients, of course, needs to be known by the AS from before. So they need to be registered somehow. An additional layer on top of this code flow we can add in to make it a little bit more secure is mutual TLS. Mutual TLS relies on public key infrastructure, a way of distributing secret keys or asymmetric keys, key pairs and certificates that goes with them that clients can use to authenticate themselves. So by using these, we can enable a more secure client authentication. So the back channel request can actually be using a mutual TLS connection instead, and it will be able to receive a token that's not only the same token, but it's also bound to the certificate. We can enable token binding here. And so if you're aware of OAuth, we know that OAuth is bearer tokens. Anyone who has a token can use it. As long as it's valid, you can always throw it against an API and hope that you will get something back. By using mutual TLS, we can actually bind the tokens to the sender. So the only one that has the token and can prove that they have the same key still valid from when the token was issued can use it. So the bearer token is cash that you find on the street, you can use it. But a sender constraint token is a credit card you find on the street. You must have the PIN code to use it. So this mutual TLS is heavily used in PSD2 use cases since we have the ADAS. We already have a big PKI there where all TPPs can apply for a certificate. And by applying for a certificate, they can be trusted in all the different banks that use this pattern. We can have a registration endpoint where clients can go and register them themselves only by the fact that they have this ADAS certificate, which of course is a huge benefit. We don't have any onboarding, it's just automatic. TPPs can do it themselves. Mutual TLS is not all fun and dandy. It brings in a bit of complexity. Certificates expire, for instance. What happens when a token issued to a holder of a specific key that is attached to a certificate that expired, and next comes a new client trying to use that key, trying to use that token that we issued to its previous certificate? Should they be valid? Or how do I renew my token after that happens? Things like that makes it more complex. It's of course solvable, and the specifications of Berlin Group in UK, they do standardize how to handle it, but it's very complex. But also, when you're a PSD2 bank, you have to give away 2 types of APIs. But what we've seen with customers after the PSD2 is that many want to expand that and start selling other APIs. If you are only allowing PSD2 TPPs to access your APIs, it's going to be harder to expand it. And if you're going to have clients that comes outside of it, you're going to have to invent your own PKI outside of it. And it's becoming harder to coexist with those types of things. So mutual TLS in itself is a very good thing, but we might need to come up with something more to handle those other use cases and other regulations where you don't have the ADAS. Another thing that's common in the common pain point in the PC2 project is the payment transactions. In a typical code flow, the user needs to consent to give away a certain access, but you only do it once. You can consent to say that TPP-X is going to, I'm going to allow TPP-X access to my account for the rest of a time period, but I don't want to do the same about payments, that they always can do payments on behalf of me. I want to be able to consent for each payment. So if I move 100 kroners to an account, I must consent to exactly that and not just payments. And a pattern that's used around the globe for that use case is the lodging intent pattern, which is a pattern that allows clients to get transactional access tokens that are only valid for a specific operation, and allows the users also to consent to this specific transactional data. It starts kind of like this. A third party is already registered. We already had some kind of access to the platform. But when I try to create a transaction on behalf of my current user, I must start with calling the API platform with an intent to transfer. And so I make a request over to the API platform with the intent transferring 100 kroners to Daniel's account. I'm using my mutual TLS certificate and probably a token that I got from somewhere before to authenticate this request. But what comes back is just an ID. We didn't do any transaction or anything. We just, this is your transaction ID, now get it consented to. To get this consented, the third party must now call the banking server and say, I need access to the scope payment column QE123. So I need to consent to this specific transaction with my current user. Since the banking server can't really just ask the user, do you want to consent to this ID here? You must get some kind of natural text for that. It must turn around and ask the APIs and see what does this ID mean? And if it's a valid ID and stars are aligned, we get back the contents of this transaction. And the banking server can then mangle that into some kind of natural text or a list of things for the user to consent to. And the user will consent either by authenticating or pressing yes in a web page, or perhaps in their authenticator app to get a notification. Depends a little bit on what type of regulation, but they need to consent somehow. But when the user consented, send back the code again, and the third party can switch that code for tokens, and you get back that sender constraint tokens. And this token is valid for only one single request for that ID and that transaction ID that we got back from the initial one. So the lodging intent pattern is it's a bit implementation heavy. Forgive me for this, Chris, but API is not standardized. That's not really true, because in UK, Open Banking and Berlin Group does standardize it, but it's not standardized outside of it. And if a new regulation is picking the same thing up, we are going to either use those standards or create new ones. Typically, there've been create new ones. That's been the solution to that. But this is something that could be picked up by things like OpenID Foundation to make this even better. And also, the client is still not authenticated in the front channel. We do get an ID in the front channel that's only usable if it's been created in the correct way before, but it's still not authenticating the client. So to cope with these smaller things that we found from this, and the OpenID Foundation and others has started to create these standards that not replacing, but are helping. So for mutual TLS, we have new standards could be called JAR and JARM. I'm going to uncover those in a bit. And for logic intent, we have PAR and RAR. So JAR and JARM are JOT secured authorization requests and JOT secured authorization response mode. It's JARM. And with this a little bit, a little twist to OpenID Connect Core to make it the message integrity intact. So for JAR, for instance, JAR is the request. And if you look at OpenID Connect, the typical request is a GET request with some query parameters. And JARM is the same request, but we take those parameters, put it in a JOT and sign it, and then send it to the request on the query string, which means that the client is actually authenticating by signing that JOT, and the authorization server can validate that it comes from a trusted source already from the front channel request. And JARM is on the way back, because OpenID Connect will respond with a redirect to the redirect URI with some query parameters that you need to parse out and use. Those could be coming from an attacker, but if you're using JARM, the response is in a JOT. So the third party can also validate that the response comes from a trusted server or my trusted server before executing a request based on the response. So with JAR and JARM, we get authentication in the front channel for clients, and we get server authenticated in response. There might be PAI in this. We have requests where we send in like identifiers or things like that to get specific tokens. Oh, in that case, we can encrypt the tokens as well, so we don't get any PAI in the system. But there's also an additional way that we could hide that. Should point out that this is not replacing mutual TLS. If we're looking at the FAPI standards, the FAPI 2 ones are saying that you can use either or, either JAR-JARM or mutual TLS. But for the logic intent pattern, we have PAR and RAR, which is pushed authorization request and rich authorization request. And those are used in conjunction. We start with the push one. This is also the same authorization request that we saw with OpenID Connect and JAR, but if you're using pushed authorization request, we send the authorization request on the back channel. So we start by pushing an object containing my parameters, and we get back a URI, but that represents this object. And then we go and send the URI on the front channel. So the authorization service can see that this is a trusted request. It's already been pushed. It's a client I know of, and do all the same things that we did in OpenID Connect Core. But we started with the push where the client could be authenticated. The nice thing about this, that the push can either use client ID as secret, it can use mutual TLS, it can use JAR for this request to authenticate itself. All of the methods will work with PAR, which makes it a very nice protocol to use for these type of things. And it's also in the back channel, so no PII on the query stream. And it can be combined with JOT requests, as I said. And then we did authentication on the client. And lastly, then RAR. If you're using RAR together with PAR, you push an object on the back channel. But this is replacing the lodging intent patterns. So if we're thinking back, the client had to start with creating an intent for transaction and then making the front channel request to the AS, and the AS has to resolve the data and all of that. But instead, if we're using RAR, we can send everything in the initial request. So we're pushing in a request object containing all the data that the AS needs to be able to build that natural text consent string for the user to consent to. And we can authenticate the client right off the bat using mutual to the S or any client authentication, which is a pretty sweet deal from what we had from before. So the drawback I see here is that it's not yet finished. It's in draft stage, but it's being pushed quite heavily by the standardization groups, and it's bound to come into the FAPI advanced authorization standards that are being worked on right now. So hopefully pretty soon. And that, I would say thank you for this very quick walkthrough of these different standards. So if you have further questions, please take them now, or we can talk on Twitter if you like that.
Great.
Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for coming in. Thanks for your time, Daniel. So yeah, let's dive into some questions. We do have something in from one of our attendees here who is asking, I guess this would be for you, Daniel. Why do we want to authenticate the client in the front channel? I mean, is the identification not enough? They say, anyways, the client is authenticated when they exchange the code already.
In many cases, it's enough to authenticate in the back channel. But if we're talking open banking and similar use cases, the AS is required to do a lot with just a request from a client. So if a client just comes in and says, hey, perform this for me, and the AS starts calling external services, and they are perhaps calling authenticators to throw out push notifications to your apps and things like that.
Right.
It might throttle the server. It would get too much to do. And if we are able to authenticate the client, we can not have to do that. We can just stop them at the door and say, well, you're not allowed. We can reject them quicker.
Right. So it's not supposed to supplant, but in addition to other security implementations. Yes,
we can. If we know the client, we can also do other tricks in OAuth and OpenID, like the redirect URI is a very strict limitation that we have to have the exact redirect URI in our configuration before we redirect over to the server. If we can authenticate the client before doing that, we can be a bit more lenient and allowed for other types of use cases. I think we're gaining a lot with being able to authenticate the client earlier.
Totally. I think a lot of the viewers might be familiar with, mutual TLS, but these new standards that are emerging, like you mentioned, they're still being worked on. I'm curious to get your the state of things. What does adoption look like in the market, in the standard bodies themselves, and actual banking API implementations for new security standards like JAR, JARM, or PAR and RAR?
If we look at open banking Brazil, for instance, a lot of those are already in those specifications.
Okay.
So it's JAR and JARM is in there. You can do mutual TLS, and you can do encrypted ID tokens. A lot from the FAPI advanced stuff is in there, and they also take it a bit further and are driving the standards because they see use cases that need to solve. So I see the adoption is fairly quick in certain parts of the world, where they're still developing, I would say.
Got it.
Yeah, just to second that point, I think in markets that are established and where there's already an existing security profile that does enough, adoption of FAPI 2 is going to take its own sweet time. I'd point towards the UK, where that subject isn't even being discussed, as far as I'm aware, at a standards level just now. I think it will get easier once FAPI2 is finalized, especially the advanced profile, and also where the vendors start to implement features. So yeah, I think it's going to vary hugely around the world.
Another viewer, Zach Mesnard, is wondering, just a little question, how do you stop illegitimate tokens to gain access to endpoints? Do you use, for example, an API gateway, knowing it should be PSD2 compliant? And I think I know the answer, but I'm going to throw the ball to Daniel on this one.
Yeah. So gateway is a good thing to have in front of your API, because they can act as the gatekeeper and not let illegitimate tokens in. I would say typically your API shouldn't see illegitimate tokens. Most often they would have to do like advanced authorization that the gateway can't handle, but invalid tokens should never reach your API, in my opinion.
Yeah, any thoughts there?
I'll ask a question. I just want to ask a question. How does RA relate to grant management?
RAR is input to the grant.
Right.
So,
okay.
Yeah. So what ends up in the grant comes from the authorization details of RAR.
Are they two separate standards then, RA and grant management? Because I know grant management's already gone into FAPI2. Is RA also being developed separately?
Yeah, they're separate. Grant management just defines the consent API from the UK group, more or less. So it's an API for managing your consents, and also extends the protocol a bit for a client to be able to use the authorized endpoint to get a larger scope or things like that. So it's so RAR is used in conjunction with that, but they're completely separate specs.
So slight side question, is RA going to be a market specific specification, do you think, or is it going to be a universal OpenID specification?
They're aiming for it to be generic, just to be used in any use case, more or less. I think there's people from the hard specification side that also are looking into this, and there's the spec makers are not entirely open banking people. So I think their goal is wider than that.
I assume that there's identity assurance style inputs to that as well. So
yeah.
Sorry, I'm hogging the questions. I do apologize.
Chris, you kind of hit on something I wanted to bring up anyways, like Curity, you guys use the term financial grade all the time to talk about these standards, but it's not necessarily only relegated to open banking. A lot of this can be applied within other industries. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah, it's merely the grade of security. It's not the application of it. It's just, you could just as well use it in insurance or in healthcare or in any. It's just that the grade of security is some financial grade, so we need to keep it high.
Yeah. Also, let's see. We have another question coming in. So a lot of API providers are using an API management vendor, that they assume should be handling this kind of stuff. So like, what is the role of an API gateway such as an Apigee in securing an open banking flow? I guess we could start with Daniel on this, and maybe Chris, if you have any ideas.
Yeah. So the role of the API gateway is, being the gatekeeper for your APIs. It's about validating the token that comes in, making sure that it's correct, and perhaps making a coarser grained authorization decision, saying that to access these APIs, you need at least the accounts scope, but I can take the full authorization decision that the API has to do with that. So the API gateway acts as a little bit more than a reverse proxy, but doing things like throttling all of this gateway stuff, but keeping the finer authorization decisions into the APIs is my view of the thing.
Yeah, I mean, at a practical level, where places I've worked, some of them will do the SSL termination through mutual TLS. So some of them don't, obviously. Commonly, organizations stick an Nginx or something in front of them. Some organizations use them to do access token introspection, where their OAuth stack and their API gateway are separate. So you'll do a call out to your IAM stack in order to introspect an access token and do some apply some permissions, especially where you've got a rich authorization object in the form of a consent like you have in the UK. So you get a call from a consumer at a given endpoint. You want to make sure that consent has actually been granted to that endpoint for that end user to that third party. So actually being able to do a call out and do the access token introspection, check that the consent matches the permissions that's being asked real time, every single time. It's quite important. A competitor to Curity does that. I'm not going to mention their name because that wouldn't be fair. I'm sure Curity does it as well. Yeah, some organizations, they actually do, they do a load of mediation inside their API gateways. So they do a considerable amount of application code. Let's say they use a Amazon gateway and Lambda using JavaScript in order to orchestrate between backend systems and front end. So just doing transformations of the payloads. Bunch of different functions. I mean, that last one, I don't massively recommend because it kind of overloads the API gateway. They should be skinny and light as far as I'm concerned. So yeah,
it kind of sounds like natively they might not support this, but with additional tooling, it's possible to work in tandem with a gateway, if I understand it.
Yeah. I mean, most gateways have some sort of programmatic mechanism in them. They allow you to write application code in order to, as I say, do things like payload mediation. I get something in, I turn it into something else, and I send that out the back to a back-end system, which might be on a message queue or whatever, right? But the thing that's challenging around it, from my perspective, is always the organization has to support using the gateway in that way. And in lots of organizations, it's kind of orthogonal to how they write applications. And the organization has to have an operating mechanism to allow deployment to the gateway with application code that's not going to affect other applications that are also using that gateway. So that's where using a gateway in that way becomes quite tricky. It's more about the operational management of the thing than the actual capabilities of it. Yeah, fine. You can run an application on it, but actually changing it becomes hard and problematic. So,
any thoughts there, Daniel, before we move on?
I think you covered a lot of it, but one sentiment I got in there: they should be slim and light. I would add, I'm fairly stupid into that. Just adding
absolutely.
Adding too much logic into your gateway typically ends up with a hornet's nest of code somewhere, and it's always hard to find those later on in the process.
I see. One of our listeners is also wondering, like, should we say that they are the resource server for our APIs in an open banking context, or is this not their role?
I don't think it's their role.
Yeah.
They should act, they're the perimeter of your API, but the API is still a resource server. The resource server has the data. It knows how to do the authorization and all of the business logic. API gateway is there to block unintended use.
Got it. I'd love to kind of hop back to some of the content, Chris, you covered in the first session there. I love bringing you in for these, Chris, because you have a lot of different perspectives. You've worked with a lot of different groups and standard bodies, and you extol the benefits of them, saying developers need standard bodies to work for them. You also work with open API specification. which is a standards body itself. I'm curious if you think, the open banking standard bodies can learn anything from the open API community, because from my perspective, it seems like open API is a pretty active and, it has a very transparent community and governance model, and they're pretty vocal about updates and communication with the tooling community. Are there things the open and banking standards should be considering, and is this a good guiding light for them?
So I think the answer is sometimes. So yeah, the Open API initiative obviously is very open. Every conversation it has is conducted out in the open, typically through GitHub issues. It's developer centric. It's trying to foster a spirit of collaboration and consensus across many different protagonists. Okay, so in terms of how it conducts itself, it has benefits to being like that, but also ultimately you need a tight group writing the specification at the top and doing the work, who can take all that input and turn it into something usable, workable, relevant, and fit for the community. Open banking probably couldn't operate like that, I don't think, in terms of standards bodies. There's too many vested interests. There's too much opportunity to wrestle control away from the community. It needs strong orchestration in the right places. I think that's why the UK jumped ahead when it did, because it had a standards body that took control. And yes, it was it did benefit from the fact it was well funded, but by a branch of the UK government and the banks themselves. But ultimately, that group was able to wrestle control of the dialogue. And what they didn't do very well was always making sure that everybody was represented. So you need a combination, in my view, in the standards bodies, of strong leadership and also good representation, so that you get, the standards pushed along well, but also you need to take into account the needs of everybody. If the open banking standards are lacking in some ways, it's taking into account, the needs of third-party providers. Yes, they give them what they need to get the basics of the ecosystem, right? But now it's time for a more inclusive approach, where you really take into account, the needs of everyone, not just let's get some APIs in the banks. So yeah, bring in some more open collaborative behaviors, but keep the strong leadership. That's tricky, but I really think that's the most relevant approach to the development of open banking standards.
Yeah, Daniel, what's your take on governance and evolution of standards, especially ones that affect the security of open banking?
Yeah, I don't have a lot of experience of working with standard bodies, but working as an outsider, I always feel that they're quite hard to get into. So what Chris is talking about, being open and being represented, is something that should be very useful for the community, and being able to come in with ideas and being transparent in their work. I think it would be a very good thing to improve on.
Yeah, excellent. I have one last question here, kind of for the both of you, trying to see some parallels between the two presentations. So at the end of the day, who is responsible for open banking security? Is it the role of the standard bodies themselves, or the banking API providers, or the third-party fintechs that are integrating with these APIs, or the end customer themselves, or is it a combination of all of the above? Daniel, if you could start here, if you have any ideas.
Yeah, it's a good question. Well, I wouldn't say all of the above, because I don't think that end users or even third parties should be taking care of this type of security. But it's of course those standard bodies and vendors like us that implement those standards, and also the banks that implement them actually on their site. It's kind of a work together to make those platforms so that a third party client can't do anything wrong and harm our security, because the protocols must be tight, the implementations must be tight, so that third party client can go rogue, and that shouldn't deserve anything.
Right.
Yeah. So in terms of like technical security, yeah, the data provider, the person implementing their APIs according to the FAPI standards or whatever, they're the chief custodian of security. But the security of the data is wider than just that interaction. So it's implicit, I think, on the third-party providers to be good citizens. They have to act in a way that might not be governed by a specific security standard, but ensures that they look after the user's data. At the end of the day, they're getting the data of one of their customers from one of their customers' accounts. Therefore, they have to be a good guardian of that data. And there's some things like GDPR in the UK and in Europe. UK is not in the EU anymore, but we still have GDPR because it's on our statute books for however long it stays there. Just being a good custodian of the data and making sure that it's secured in the relevant way. And then there'll be things like, local market regulations on data storage. There'll be a mass of different things that step way beyond the standards, but just mean that the third party is acting as a good custodian of the data. There is discussion at the FAPI working group about tests for line parties as well. So actually the consumers of the data. I don't think that they have come into being yet, but being able to, as a third party, go and say, okay, any obligations on me in terms of this security standard, I can do some tests and then certify that I'm doing the right things in terms of how I interact with the server, which would have some value and would help, I think, to some extent, tie up both ends of the pipe, if you like. But yeah, the being a good custodian of that data is way beyond the scope of just the API provider. It really is in the sphere of the third party provider as well. So, I mean, and end users, they can't do anything technically, but they've got to not do anything stupid, as well. So give your bank account details away.
Yeah, there's a lot of social engineering stuff that could happen so easily. And sure, the standards are in place, but if you're just convinced to do something. Yeah. Well, I that's all I had in terms of questions. You guys have covered a lot of ground today. Thank you so much for your presentations. I'm just going to sign off with a couple little tidbits from the world of Nordic APIs, and then we'll wrap it up. We actually do have an API strategy for open banking ebook that I thought I'd mention. You can pick this up in any sort of ebook format if you go to nordicapis.com/ebooks. We cover a little bit of the standards mentioned today, as well as just the business strategy behind setting up an API in the banking context. So check that out if you're interested. We are doing more of these live casts before we return with physical events. If you have a cool idea that you'd love to share in one of these events, feel free to submit a talk. You can find our call for speakers page at nordicapis.com or hit us up at Twitter. And if you love APIs and just want to submit an article, we like to have an open platform for people from within the community to share their thoughts and ideas. So you can visit our nordicapis.com/createwithus page for information on submitting. And for those of you unaware or not following it yet, I do maintain a bi-weekly newsletter, has a lot of great information. We'll do a blog wrap up on this session too, which you can find in your email inbox if you are subscribed to this. And lastly, thank you so much to our sponsor, Curity. You can find their access to management and identity control solutions at curity.io. All right, that's it for today. Thank you, everybody.